The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the bustling international airport, casting golden streaks across the polished floors. Travelers dragged their suitcases, children clung to their parents' hands, and announcements blared over the intercom system. Amidst the chaos stood General Marcus Reed, a tall man with an air of quiet dignity. His uniform was crisp, adorned with medals that caught the light as he moved toward Gate 32. Marcus had just returned from a year-long deployment overseas, where he led troops in safeguarding peace during turbulent times. He carried not only his luggage but also the weight of countless sacrifices made by those under his command. For once, though, there was relief in his eyes, a longing to see his family after months apart. This flight would take him home, back to the warmth of his wife's embrace and the laughter of his two young daughters. As Marcus approached the gate, his phone buzzed softly. It was a text from his wife. "We miss you so much. Safe travels, my hero." A small smile tugged at his lips, softening the stern lines etched into his face by years of service. But before he could reply, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me," came a curt tone behind him. Turning around, Marcus found himself facing Charles Whitmore, a middle-aged man dressed in an expensive tailored suit. Charles held his boarding pass tightly in one hand while adjusting his designer sunglasses with the other. His sharp features were framed by neatly combed silver hair, giving him an air of authority, or arrogance, depending on how you looked at it. Charles glanced down at Marcus's uniform briefly before speaking again. "Are you aware this is first class?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled disdain. Marcus blinked, taken aback by the question. "Yes, sir," he replied, calmly. "I'm seated here." "Well," Charles said, drawing out the word as if savoring its impact, "perhaps someone like you might feel more comfortable elsewhere. Economy class isn't far away." For a moment, silence hung between them like a heavy curtain. Around them, passengers shuffled past without paying much attention, absorbed in their own worlds. Marcus felt the familiar sting of prejudice prickling beneath his skin, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he straightened his posture slightly, meeting Charles's gaze directly. "I earned my seat, sir," Marcus responded evenly. "Just as I've earned everything else I have." Charles opened his mouth to retort, then hesitated. There was something about the general's calm confidence that unsettled him, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Still, pride prevented him from backing down immediately. Before either man could say another word, the gate agent called for first-class passengers to begin boarding. With a final glance at Charles, Marcus stepped forward, leaving the businessman, standing awkwardly near the counter. As Marcus walked toward the jet bridge, he reminded himself why he endured such moments. Resilience wasn't just part of his job description. It was woven into the fabric of who he was. What he didn't know yet was that this encounter was only the beginning of something far greater than either man could have anticipated. And somewhere, deep inside, Charles felt a flicker of unease, a whisper of doubt creeping into his carefully constructed worldview. As General Marcus Reed stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air of the plane greeted him. He paused briefly to adjust the strap of his carry-on bag before entering the aircraft. Inside, the first-class cabin exuded luxury, plush leather seats, soft ambient lighting, and attendants ready with warm smiles. It was a stark contrast to the cramped quarters he'd endured during military transport flights. For once, Marcus allowed himself to appreciate the comfort. He found his assigned seat near the window, a perfect spot for watching clouds drift by during the long journey home. As he settled in, placing his uniform cap carefully on the empty seat beside him, the flight attendant approached with a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, General," she said warmly, recognizing the rank insignia on his uniform. "Thank you for your service. Can I get you anything before we take off?" Marcus returned her smile graciously. "Just some water for now, thank you." While the attendant fetched his drink, Charles Whitmore appeared at the entrance of the cabin. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he scanned the rows, searching for his seat. When he spotted Marcus already seated in the row ahead of him, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Without a word, Charles slid into the aisle seat directly behind Marcus, leaving an elderly woman to take the middle seat reluctantly. The tension between the two men was palpable, though neither acknowledged it openly. Charles busied himself arranging his belongings, making unnecessary noise as he stuffed his coat into the overhead compartment. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on adjusting his seatbelt, ignoring the subtle disruption behind him. When the flight attendant returned with Marcus's water, Charles leaned forward slightly, clearing his throat loudly enough to catch her attention. "Excuse me," he began, his voice carrying just a hint of entitlement. "Is there any chance I could switch seats? I prefer not to be so close to—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward Marcus without finishing the sentence. The attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied politely but firmly. "All seats are assigned and switching isn't possible at this time." Charles frowned but didn't press further. Instead, he sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath about these kinds of situations. The elderly woman beside him exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, who pretended not to hear. Once the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Marcus closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines soothe him. Flying always reminded him of the countless missions he'd led, the lives he'd touched, and the resilience required to endure hardship. This flight wasn't just taking him home. It symbolized a transition from duty to family, from sacrifice to peace. But Charles couldn't relax. His mind churned with irritation, replaying the earlier exchange at the gate. Why had he felt so unnerved by Marcus's presence? Was it the general's calm demeanor, or the way others seemed to respect him instinctively? Whatever it was, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation was profoundly unsettling. As the hours passed, the flight attendants continued offering refreshments and snacks. Each time they stopped by Marcus's seat, their interactions were courteous and respectful. Charles watched silently, noting how effortlessly Marcus commanded admiration. No matter how hard Charles tried to dismiss it, he couldn't deny the pang of envy growing within him. By the time dinner was served, Charles decided to make one last attempt to assert himself. Leaning forward again, he tapped Marcus lightly on the shoulder. "Pardon me," Charles said stiffly, forcing a tight smile. "Do you mind if I ask what exactly you do? You seem accomplished." Marcus turned halfway in his seat, meeting Charles's gaze steadily. "I serve my country, sir," he replied simply, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. For the first time since they'd met, Charles hesitated. There was something in Marcus's voice, an unshakable pride, that made Charles question his own assumptions. And though he quickly retreated into silence, the seed of doubt planted earlier began to grow. Unbeknownst to both men, this flight would become more than just a trip. It would challenge beliefs, spark reflection, and perhaps even lead to change. But for now, all they could do was sit in uneasy proximity, miles above the earth, each lost in their own thoughts. The hours ticked by as the plane soared through the clouds, its engines humming steadily against the backdrop of a vast blue sky. Inside the cabin, passengers had settled into their routines. Some slept, others read or watched movies on their screens. But for Charles Whitmore, restlessness lingered. Every glance at General Marcus Reed only deepened his unease. Charles couldn't pinpoint exactly why he felt so unsettled. Was it Marcus's quiet confidence? Or was it the way people seemed drawn to him, even in this confined space? The flight attendants treated him with deference, and the elderly woman seated beside Charles had struck up a brief conversation with Marcus earlier, praising his dedication to service. Charles had overheard it all, each word chipping away at his carefully constructed armor of superiority. "Why does he have to be here?" Charles muttered under his breath, adjusting his tie for the third time that hour. He glanced around nervously, hoping no one else had noticed his discomfort. Meanwhile, Marcus remained unfazed. Leaning back in his seat, he scrolled through photos of his family on his phone, a reminder of what awaited him at the end of this journey. There was a picture of his wife, Sarah, smiling brightly during their last vacation together. Another showed his daughters building sandcastles at the beach, their laughter frozen in time. These images brought him peace, grounding him amidst the turbulence. not just in the air but also from the tension radiating behind him. As the plane hit a patch of mild turbulence, causing cups to rattle slightly on the tray tables, Charles gripped the armrest tightly. His knuckles turned white as he stared out the window, trying to distract himself. When the shaking subsided, he exhaled sharply, loosening his grip. That's when he noticed something unexpected. Marcus had turned halfway in his seat, offering a reassuring smile. "First time flying?" he asked gently, his voice carrying none of the hostility Charles might have expected. "No," Charles replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. "I've flown plenty." "Ah," Marcus said, nodding understandingly. "Well, if you ever need tips for calming nerves during turbulence, let me know. I've logged more flight hours than I can count." Charles blinked, caught off guard by the gesture. For a moment he considered brushing it off with another dismissive remark, but something about Marcus's tone, a mix of kindness and authority, stopped him. Instead he mumbled, "Thanks," before quickly looking away. Despite the awkward exchange, Charles found himself glancing at Marcus more often now. Each time he saw glimpses of qualities he rarely encountered: humility, patience, strength. It gnawed at him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Later, as dinner trays were cleared away, the flight attendants handed out warm towels for passengers to freshen up. When the attendant reached Marcus, she paused to thank him again for his service. Her genuine admiration sparked yet another wave of irritation in Charles. "Doesn't he get tired of all this attention?" Charles whispered bitterly to the elderly woman beside him. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his comment. "From what I've seen, he doesn't ask for it," she replied pointedly. "Maybe people respect him because he deserves it." Her words hit Charles like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. Deep down, he knew she was right. By the time dessert was served, a decadent slice of chocolate cake, Charles's frustration had reached its peak. As the flight attendant placed a plate in front of Marcus, Charles leaned forward impulsively once more. "You know?" he began, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "All this talk about service makes me wonder, do you ever regret choosing such a difficult path?" Marcus set down his fork slowly, turning to face Charles fully. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a calm and measured tone, he responded, "Every day is hard, sir, but every day is worth it. Sacrifices mean nothing unless they're made for something greater than yourself." Charles stared at him, stunned. The simplicity of Marcus's answer struck a chord within him, stirring emotions he'd buried long ago. For the rest of the flight, Charles sat quietly, lost in thought. The man sitting mere feet away wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was a mirror reflecting parts of Charles he didn't want to see. And as the plane descended toward its destination, Charles realized this encounter would leave a mark far deeper than either of them could have anticipated. Little did they know, the real journey was only beginning. The plane began its descent, slicing through layers of clouds as the city skyline emerged in the distance. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred from their seats, collecting belongings and preparing for landing. But while most were focused on what lay ahead, reuniting with loved ones or diving into work obligations, Charles Whitmore remained lost in thought. For hours, he had sat silently, replaying Marcus's words over and over in his mind. Sacrifices mean nothing unless they're made for something greater than yourself. The phrase echoed like a mantra, forcing Charles to confront years of deeply ingrained beliefs. He had always prided himself on his success, his wealth, his polished appearance, his status in society. But now, those achievements seemed hollow, compared to the quiet dignity Marcus carried. As the wheels touched down with a gentle thud, Charles glanced out the window, watching the tarmac roll past. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar emotion. Guilt. It wasn't just the tension between him and Marcus that weighed on him. It was the realization that he'd spent decades looking down on others without truly understanding them. When the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began disembarking, Marcus stood first, retrieving his cap and carry-on bag. Before stepping into the aisle, he turned slightly toward Charles and offered a polite nod. "Safe travels," he said simply, his tone warm yet distant. Charles opened his mouth to respond but found no words. Instead, he watched as Marcus moved gracefully down the aisle, exchanging brief smiles with fellow passengers who greeted him warmly. The elderly woman beside Charles sighed softly. "He's quite remarkable, isn't he?" she remarked almost to herself. "Yes," Charles admitted quietly, surprising even himself. Once Marcus disappeared from view, Charles lingered in his seat, letting other passengers file out ahead of him. The elderly woman eventually rose, giving him a knowing look before leaving. Alone in the now empty row, Charles allowed himself to reflect further. Why had he been so quick to judge Marcus? Was it fear, ignorance, or perhaps a need to protect the fragile walls he'd built around his worldview? Whatever the reason, Charles couldn't deny that this encounter had shaken him to his core. By the time he stepped off the plane, the terminal buzzed with activity. Families reunited joyfully, colleagues greeted one another with handshakes, and travelers hurried toward baggage claim. Charles scanned the crowd instinctively, searching for Marcus. To his surprise, he spotted the general standing near a coffee kiosk, speaking with a young boy who clutched a toy soldier tightly. Marcus knelt down to meet the child's eye level, smiling as he autographed the toy. The boy beamed with excitement, his mother thanking Marcus profusely. Watching the scene unfold, Charles felt a pang of admiration and regret. How many opportunities had he missed to connect with people meaningfully? Dragging his feet toward baggage claim, Charles replayed the moment in his head. Why did Marcus inspire such respect and gratitude? The answer came to him slowly, because Marcus gave selflessly, expecting nothing in return. At baggage claim, Charles retrieved his suitcase and headed toward the exit. As he pushed open the glass doors leading outside, he saw Marcus again, this time hugging a beautiful woman and two giggling girls who threw their arms around him enthusiastically. The sight filled Charles with an unexpected ache. He hailed a taxi and climbed inside, staring blankly at the seat in front of him. For the first time in years, Charles questioned everything he stood for. Who was he really? And more importantly, who did he want to become? The taxi driver broke the silence. "Where to, sir?" Charles hesitated, then muttered, "Just drive for now." As the car pulled away from the curb, Charles resolved to make a change. Not because he owed it to anyone else, but because he owed it to himself. This flight may have ended, but the journey within had only begun. Little did he know, destiny wasn't done with him yet. The taxi ride stretched longer than Charles Whitmore intended, the cityscape blurring past his window as he stared blankly ahead. His mind was a whirlpool of emotions: guilt, regret, and an unsettling desire to understand the man who had unknowingly upended his worldview. Marcus Reed's calm demeanor, unwavering humility, and quiet strength lingered in Charles's thoughts like a shadow he couldn't shake. When the taxi finally stopped at a red light, Charles glanced out the window and saw something that made him sit up straighter. Across the street, volunteers were setting up tables for what appeared to be a community event, a food drive. At the center of it all stood Marcus, laughing warmly as he helped unload boxes of supplies from a van. His family was there too, handing out sandwiches and bottled water to those waiting in line. Charles hesitated, torn between staying in the safety of the cab and stepping into unfamiliar territory. He paid the driver hastily and stepped out, lingering, on the sidewalk across the street. Watching Marcus interact with people from all walks of life stirred something deep within him. It wasn't just admiration this time, it was envy. For years, Charles had prided himself on climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth, and surrounding himself with luxury. Yet, here was Marcus, finding fulfillment not in material possessions, but in service to others. Charles wondered how someone could derive such joy from giving, when he himself felt empty despite having everything money could buy. Summoning his courage, Charles crossed the street and approached the bustling scene cautiously. A volunteer greeted, him with a clipboard asking if he wanted to help or receive assistance. Charles stammered awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Before he could retreat, Marcus spotted him. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said, his voice steady but kind. "What brings you here?" Caught off guard, Charles fumbled for words. I saw your family helping out. Thought I'd see what this is about." Marcus smiled warmly, gesturing toward the volunteers. "We're just doing our part to support the community. There's always room for more hands if you're interested." Charles froze, unsure whether Marcus was mocking him subtly or genuinely inviting him to join. But one look at Marcus's sincere expression erased any doubt. Slowly, Charles nodded. Young volunteer handed him a stack of flyers while another guided him to a table where meals were being assembled. For the next hour, Charles worked alongside strangers, packing bags of groceries and distributing them to families in need. Each interaction left him feeling increasingly humbled. One elderly woman thanked him tearfully, clutching her bag of supplies tightly. Another man shook his hand firmly, expressing gratitude for the meal that would feed his children tonight. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues over the busy street, Charles found himself working beside Marcus. They exchanged few words, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt meaningful, a shared understanding passing between them without the need for conversation. At one point, Marcus leaned closer to Charles and said softly, "You know, sometimes we don't realize how much we have until we share it with others." Charles paused, gripping a box of canned goods tightly. The simplicity of Marcus's statement struck him deeply. All his life he had hoarded his wealth, viewing generosity as weakness. Now, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers united by purpose, he began to see its true power. By the time the event wound down, exhaustion settled over Charles, not from physical labor but from the emotional weight of his realizations. As volunteers packed up the remaining supplies, Marcus approached him once more. "Thank you for coming today," Marcus said sincerely. "It takes courage to step outside your comfort zone." Charles swallowed hard, meeting Marcus's gaze. "No, thank you. I think I needed this more than anyone." They parted ways after exchanging brief goodbyes, but Charles knew this wasn't the end. This experience had ignited something inside him, a spark of change he couldn't ignore. Driving home later that evening, Charles realized his journey was far from over. What started as a chance encounter on a flight had grown into something transformative. And though he still had much to learn, one thing was certain: he was ready to rewrite the script of his life. What he didn't know yet was that Marcus's influence would ripple even further, shaping not only Charles's future, but also the lives of those around him. In the weeks following the food drive, Charles Whitmore found himself unable to return to his old routines. The opulent dinners at exclusive restaurants, the board meetings filled with empty small talk, and the endless pursuit of profit no longer held the same allure. Each day felt like a reminder of how disconnected he had been, not just from others but from himself. Determined to make sense of the shift within him, Charles began researching volunteer opportunities in his city. He started small, donating funds anonymously to local charities and attending community events. But sitting on the sidelines wasn't enough. He craved the same sense of purpose he'd witnessed in Marcus Reed. So, one Saturday morning, Charles showed up at a homeless shelter downtown, ready to roll up his sleeves. At first, the staff eyed him skeptically. Dressed in casual slacks and a button-down shirt, a far cry from his usual tailored suits, Charles looked out of place among the volunteers wearing worn jeans and sneakers. Yet, when he offered to help wherever needed, they handed him an apron, without hesitation. For hours, Charles worked alongside strangers, serving meals and cleaning tables. The work was simple, even mundane, but it grounded him in ways he hadn't expected. One man, seated alone in a corner, caught Charles's attention. His weathered face told stories of hardship, yet his eyes carried a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," the man said quietly as Charles placed a plate of food in front of him. "It's good to know people still care." The words struck Charles deeply. How many times had he walked past someone in need, pretending not to see? Guilt washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by determination. If he couldn't undo the past, he could at least shape the future. Word spread quickly about Charles's newfound involvement in charitable efforts. Some of his business associates raised eyebrows, questioning why a man of his stature would waste time on such trivial pursuits. Others dismissed it as a fleeting phase, assuming he'd grow bored and return to his lavish lifestyle. But Charles surprised them all. He began using his resources to amplify his impact. Leveraging his connections, he organized fundraising galas for underfunded schools and spearheaded campaigns to provide affordable housing for low-income families. What started as tentative steps toward change blossomed into a full-fledged commitment to service. One evening, while attending a charity gala he'd helped organize, Charles spotted Marcus across the room. The general stood surrounded by admirers, sharing stories of resilience and leadership. Sensing Charles's presence, Marcus excused himself and approached him with a warm smile. "I heard about your recent projects," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Congratulations, you're making a real difference." Charles shook his hand firmly, feeling a swell of pride mixed with humility. "I couldn't have done it without inspiration, from someone who reminded me what truly matters." Marcus chuckled softly. "You give yourself too little credit. Change starts from within. I merely gave you a nudge." Their conversation continued long after the event ended, delving into topics ranging from family to faith to the importance of leaving a legacy that transcended wealth. By the time they parted ways, Charles felt a renewed sense of clarity. But the transformation didn't stop there. Inspired by Marcus's example, Charles decided to mentor young professionals seeking guidance. Through workshops and networking events, he encouraged them to use their skills not just for personal gain, but for the betterment of society. His message resonated deeply, sparking a ripple effect that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. As months turned into years, Charles became known not just as a successful businessman, but as a compassionate advocate for change. Though he never sought recognition, his actions spoke louder than any title or accolade ever could. Yet even as his life took on new meaning, Charles knew this journey was far from complete. Every act of kindness, every moment of connection brought him closer to understanding the true essence of humanity. And though Marcus remained a guiding figure in his life, Charles realized the most profound lessons came not from emulating others, but from discovering his own potential. Little did he know, fate had one final twist in store, a moment that would test everything he'd learned and solidify his place in the world forever. Years had passed since Charles Whitmore's life-altering encounter with General Marcus Reed. What began as a single moment of tension aboard a flight had blossomed into a journey of growth, reflection, and transformation. Now in his late 60s, Charles stood on stage at a community center packed with people eager to hear him speak. The event celebrated the launch of a scholarship fund he'd established, a program designed to support underprivileged youth pursuing careers in public service. As Charles adjusted the microphone, scanning the sea of faces before him, he felt a surge of gratitude. This wasn't just his achievement. It was the culmination of lessons learned from Marcus and countless others who had inspired him along the way. "Thank you all for being here today," Charles began, his voice steady but warm. "When I started this journey, I didn't know where it would lead. All I knew was that something inside me needed to change." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "For years I lived my life believing success was measured by wealth and status. But then I met someone who showed me otherwise, someone who reminded me that true fulfillment comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we contribute." The audience erupted into applause, many nodding in agreement. Seated near the front row, Marcus watched with quiet pride, his wife and daughters smiling beside him. When the applause subsided, Charles continued, "This scholarship is more than financial. It's an investment in our future leaders. It's about creating opportunities for young people to make a difference in their communities, just as I've tried to do in mine." Tears welled up in the eyes of some attendees as Charles shared stories of students already benefiting from the program. One recipient, a high school senior named Jasmine, rose to her feet and hugged Charles tightly, whispering, Thank you for believing in us. After the ceremony, guests mingled over refreshments, congratulating Charles and expressing admiration for his work. Marcus approached him last, extending a hand that Charles eagerly shook. "You've come a long way," Marcus said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm proud of you." Charles smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "None of this would have happened without your example. You taught me that leadership isn't about power, it's about service." Marcus chuckled softly. "And you've proven that anyone can choose to lead with heart." Their conversation drifted toward lighter topics, the joys of family, memories, of past projects and plans for the future. As they parted ways later that evening, Charles reflected on how much his life had changed. He no longer recognized the man he used to be, the one consumed by pride and prejudice. In his place stood someone grounded in humility, driven by purpose and connected to humanity in ways he once thought impossible. Months later, news spread of Charles's decision to step down from his corporate role entirely, dedicating himself full-time to philanthropy. His story became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to embrace change and use their resources for good. Schools, shelters, and community centers bore his name, not as a testament to ego, but as a reminder of what could be achieved through compassion and determination. One crisp autumn morning, as Charles strolled through a park where children played and families laughed, he realized something profound. True legacy wasn't etched in stone or written in headlines. It was woven into lives touched and hearts transformed. And somewhere, miles away, Marcus Reed smiled knowingly, aware that the ripple effect of kindness would continue spreading far, beyond either of them. Though their paths had diverged, their bond remained, a testament to the power of understanding, redemption, and the enduring impact of choosing to see the best in others.